When we talk about launching something revolutionary, whether that's like a new app, a groundbreaking political movement, or even just a decentralized financial system,
Yeah.
we usually operate under this incredibly naive assumption.
Oh, absolutely. The airtight vault theory.
Yes, exactly, the airtight vault. We tend to think that if the original code is clean, right, like if the core idea is just fundamentally flawless and objectively good for society, it'll just automatically work.
Right, the assumption that truth just operates in a frictionless vacuum.
Right. You build this perfectly sealed vault of truth, you lock your brilliant new paradigm inside, and you just assume the world is forced to deal with it.
But that is, it's a complete myth.
It's a total myth.
Yeah.
Because when you study the actual history of how massive systemic change happens, you realize the vault was never airtight to begin with.
Not even close.
In reality, launching a movement is much more like launching a high-stakes open-source software project.
Yeah.
The absolute second you push that code out into the world, it is immediately, ruthlessly bombarded.
And the fascinating part about that bombardment is the nature of the attack itself. It is rarely a direct frontal assault.
Right. They aren't trying to just burn the servers down.
Exactly. The threat profile of structural change is silent, internal capture. It's actors submitting millions of tiny, malicious pull requests.
Subtle modifications.
Right. Modifications designed to quietly redirect what the software actually does while, conveniently keeping the original name on the project. The people who benefit from the old ways, they don't stand outside the castle throwing rocks.
They just put on the uniform of the new movement.
Yeah, they walk right through the front door and volunteer to manage the archives.
Which brings us to exactly what we are doing here today. We are taking you, the listener, on a highly conceptual, intellectually rigorous journey into the raw mechanics of civilizational survival.
It's a fascinating topic.
It really is. So the source material we are dissecting in this deep dive today is a remarkably dense, standalone lecture. It's lecture 7 of a 13-part series.
And it focuses on a very specific foundational text.
Yes. Surah Al-Hajj, Ayat 52. But, and this is crucial, we are setting theology entirely aside.
Right, no sentimentality, no religious folklore.
None of that. We are looking at this text strictly as master systems engineers. Our mission is to map out the exact sociological mechanics of how reform movements are launched, how they are inevitably hijacked by the status quo, and the built-in self-correcting mechanisms required to purge those distortions.
The overarching theme is civilizational resilience. The text itself operates as this universal blueprint for how equitable systems survive in deeply inequitable environments.
So let's just pull up the anchor text,
Yeah.
verse 52. I'm going to read the standard translation the source provides, just so we have our baseline.
Sounds good.
Okay, it says, quote, "We never sent before you any messenger or prophet, but that when he set his aspiration," and the Arabic word there is tamana.
Which is a huge focal point for us later.
Right, so when he set his tamana, Satan cast something into his aspiration, and the word there is enia.
Right.
Then God nullifies what Satan casts, and God establishes his signs, end quote.
Now, reading that for the first time without any kind of systemic lens.
It sounds like a myth. I mean, on the surface, it sounds like an isolated historical glitch. Like some guy is trying to do good, a literal red demon whispers in his ear, he makes a mistake, and God has to swoop down and patch the bug.
And that is exactly how traditional commentaries have framed it for centuries. The primary objective of our source lecture is to just completely bulldoze that superficial reading.
Yeah, let's talk about the folklore, because the source spends a lot of time dismantling this one specific rumor. The Gharaniq incident.
Or the Satanic Verses story, as it's often known in Western academia.
Right. I want to walk through this because it is vital to understand what we are throwing out. So the rumor goes like this, right? The leader of this massive reform movement in Mecca is facing intense pushback from the Quraysh.
The incredibly wealthy, entrenched elite ruling class. It's exactly the monopolists. And supposedly, during a public speech, this reformer just succumbs to the pressure and makes this massive, cowardly compromise. He allegedly utters a few lines praising 3 pagan deities, Latart, Uzza, and Manat.
He essentially says their intercession is to be hoped for.
Which, politically speaking, is just an insane olive branch.
It would be the ultimate concession, because those idols weren't just religious statues, They were the entire economic engine of Mecca. They drove the pilgrimage trade. They consolidated the elite's power.
Right. Acknowledging them would be like a radical modern progressive suddenly endorsing totally unregulated offshore banking just to appease Wall Street billionaires.
It fundamentally contradicts the core platform.
Completely. But the story goes that the Meccan elite were so thrilled by this compromise that everyone bowed down together in peace. And then, supposedly, this rumor travels all the way across the Red Sea to Abyssinia.
Where the early refugees of the movement had fled to escape persecution. Yeah. So they hear, oh great, peace is achieved. They pack their bags, travel all the way back to Mecca, only to find out it was a trick. A satanic whisper injected into the speech that the reformer had to awkwardly take back.
The lecturer points out the sheer systemic absurdity of this entire narrative. It makes zero sense chronologically, psychologically, or sociologically.
Because of the core constitution of the movement itself?
Exactly. The whole program was based on the absolute uncompromising dismantling of the specific power structures those idols represented.
You don't build a massive reform movement on the premise that, the king is a tyrant and the monarchy must be abolished, and then just casually drop a line in a speech saying, well, but actually the king's tax policy is pretty great.
Right. It violates the basic logic of leadership. Reformers operating at a civilizational level do not make ad hoc compromises with the foundational tenets of their own program.
So we throw the Gharaniq incident in the trash. We discard the myth.
Yes.
If we do that, what is this dramatic text actually describing?
When you remove the folklore, what emerges is a universal sociological law. Just look at the phrasing. It says, we never sent before you.
Pointing backward.
Right. It's indicating a historical constant. It's not a momentary lapse by one guy in a desert. It is stating a systemic absolute. Every single socioeconomic reform program that aims for real equity acts as a threat.
And the exact second it launches, it attracts distortion.
Unavoidably. Because it threatens wealth and power.
Which goes back to the open source software analogy. The code isn't attacked because it's buggy. It's attacked because it's live and it's threatening a monopoly.
Precisely. And this requires us to extrapolate how resilient systems actually work in reality. Like, think about a biological immune system.
Or a decentralized blockchain resisting a 51% attack.
Exactly. A robust system isn't defined as one that never gets attacked. That's utopian nonsense. Real systems get breached.
Right.
A truly robust system is defined by having an internal mechanism that actively identifies the malicious code, isolates it, purges it, and consolidates the authentic baseline.
That completely reframes the whole nullification part of the verse. It's not a magic lightning bolt fixing a mistake. It is the system's immune response functioning exactly as designed under stress.
It's the operational signature of the natural order, a continuous cycle of assertion of truth, the inevitable injection of falsehood by the elite, and the systemic purging of that falsehood over time.
Wow. Okay, so let's dive deeper into the actual language being used here, because the terminology shifts the entire paradigm. We are doing a linguistic deep dive into tamana and munia.
This is where it gets really interesting.
It really does. So if you look up the standard English translation for tamana, it's almost always wish or desire or aspiration.
Which are incredibly passive words.
Right. If I say, I wish I could retire at 40, that's a passive daydream. Translating it as wish when we're talking about a civilizational blueprint feels way too weak. What does tamana actually mean in a systems framework?
The source is meticulous about this. Tama is not an idle wish. In this context, it represents the reformer's highly structured, projected aim.
The master plan.
Yes. It is the comprehensive socioeconomic program they are actively advancing to reorganize society. Think of it as the constitutional blueprint.
Okay, that makes so much more sense.
Right. When the text says the messenger set his aspiration, it means he laid out the structural program for a new, equitable order and started executing it. Tangible policies on wealth distribution, rights, rule of law.
So tamana is the active programmatic rollout.
Exactly.
Now let's look at the counterforce. The text says Satan casts something into his tamana, and the word for what is cast is nia.
Yes.
So we have to deconstruct the satanic element. If it's not a literal demon whispering in an ear, what is the sociological equivalent here?
In any rigorous sociological analysis, the satanic element consistently represents the rebellious, exploitative forces within a society.
The status quo.
The entrenched elite. The monopolists, the people who fundamentally benefit from the current imbalance of power.
And who will do absolutely anything to maintain their leverage.
Right. Therefore, the nunia they are casting into the program is the corrupting suggestion. It is the injected compromise designed to blunt the force of the reform.
Okay, let me try a very specific modern analogy to see if I'm tracking this, because I want to make sure I get the mechanics right.
Go for it.
Imagine a highly progressive, radical political bill is introduced in a modern legislature. And the core tamana, the programmatic aim, is to strictly regulate billionaires. aggressively close offshore tax havens, enforce corporate transparency.
A very clear, disruptive reform aimed at equity.
Right. The public absolutely loves it. But then the bill goes into committee. The corporate lobbyists descend on the Capitol, and the entrenched interests realize very quickly they can't hold a press conference and publicly fight a bill promising fairness.
You can't run ads saying, "We demand the right to evade taxes while you pay yours."
Exactly. It's terrible PR. So they don't fight the Tamanat directly. They get inside the committee rooms. They hire the lawyers drafting the granular language, and they quietly inject pork barrel loopholes.
Ah, yes. The 500-page addendum.
Yes. They add a 500-page addendum defining exactly what legally constitutes an offshore haven, using language so intentionally convoluted that it actually legalizes the exact evasion the bill was meant to stop.
They add grandfather clauses and self-serving glosses.
And by the time the bill passes, it's celebrated on the news as a huge victory for the people. But operationally, it serves the billionaires even better because now their evasion is explicitly codified.
That 500-page addendum filled with loopholes is the exact modern equivalent of the Naya. That is the satanic cast.
The convenient misreading.
Exactly. It's the quiet compromise clause inserted by the powerful under the guise of cooperation. They haven't destroyed the bill. They successfully co-opted it from within.
They captured the momentum and redirected it, which makes this 22.52 text profoundly relevant to today. It's not a 7th century anomaly. It's baked into the DNA of every movement aiming for structural equity.
It is the unavoidable friction of societal change. Think about basic physics. If a program doesn't challenge vested interests, if it's purely cosmetic, it won't attract infiltration.
It's ignored.
Right. But the moment it demands real redistribution of power, friction is generated, and the infiltration sequence begins.
Which bridges us perfectly to the core engine of reason behind this. Why does this happen? If a message is inherently true and objectively better for 99% of the population, why would it attract falsehood at all?
That's a great question.
I mean, let me play devil's advocate. Shouldn't the sheer truth of the program just clearly defeat the opposition in a clean fight?
Well, looking at human history, a clean fight is the one scenario entrenched power avoids at all costs. Open opposition is strategically foolish against a liberating program.
Why?
Because if you're a tyrant or a monopolist and a reformer promises freedom and justice, standing up in the public square and declaring, "No, I prefer tyranny and hoarding wealth," is an instant catalyst for a guillotine.
Yeah, you really can't win an election on a platform of let's keep things terribly unfair to your detriment.
Exactly. It just unites the fractured masses against you. Therefore, entrenched interests almost universally pivot to internal capture. Right. The intrusion is the calculated immune response of the status quo. They realize they can't stop the momentum, so they put on the robes of the movement.
They join the vanguard.
They become its most vocal proponents. And once inside the command structure, they start the slow process of reinterpretation, dilution, and smuggling in the privileges the program meant to abolish.
They hijack the steering wheel while pretending to be the most enthusiastic driver on the bus.
It's brilliant, really. Dark, but brilliant.
And the source material doesn't just theorize about this. It provides staggering historical examples of how this internal capture was attempted regarding this specific text.
The mechanics of these infiltrations are just mind-bending.
Let's walk through them, because the first massive vector of attack the source details is the concept of Naskh, abrogation.
The orthodox theory of Naskh is easily one of the most audacious ideological maneuvers in human history.
Seriously, explain how it works.
The theory suggests that within the foundational text, the Quran itself, certain later verses were revealed to actively cancel out or abrogate earlier verses.
Wait, like a self-deleting file?
Essentially, yes. And it evolved to suggest that external unwritten oral traditions, the Hadith, could also override and nullify the central written constitutional text.
From a systems design perspective, that is a mind-boggling vulnerability to willingly introduce into your own blueprint.
It's catastrophic.
You are basically claiming the ultimate divine operating system shipped with malicious code that deletes other parts of its own code. How do you convince an entire civilization that their sacred, unalterable text is full of dead links?
The psychological manipulation required is profound. The lecturer points out the sheer illogic of it. Imagine the CEO of a global corporation issues a directive. If market conditions change, they issue a new directive and say, Memo B supersedes Memo A.
Right, that's human trial and error.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But to attribute trial and error reactive legislation to an omniscient system that claims to be outside of time is a massive structural contradiction. You are projecting human incompetence onto a divine blueprint.
And the source gave incredibly stark examples of how this loophole was weaponized, like the inheritance laws. Let's look at that.
A prime socioeconomic example. The constitutional text explicitly mandates that a person must leave a written bequest for their parents and close relatives.
Which makes sense. It's a foundational instruction to ensure equitable wealth distribution.
Right. It prevents family destitution and stops wealth from automatically consolidating into the hands of a few powerful tribal leaders when someone dies.
That is a core piece of the Tinamina, grassroots economic stability.
But the vested interests, the wealthy elite who wanted to control those inheritance flows, they later introduced an isolated oral tradition, a hadith.
What did it say?
It claimed the prophet had casually said on some occasion, there is no bequest to an heir.
Just a rumor, basically.
Right. And they used this unverified, entirely external oral report to claim the original written constitutional law was officially abrogated.
So they effectively deleted a massive piece of socioeconomic regulation without having to alter a single physical word in the text.
It's a masterclass in lobbying. They bypassed the Constitution by convincing the public that a rumor was legally binding over the written law.
That is wild.
Yeah.
And there was an even darker example about the penal code, right? The punishment for adultery.
Yes. The written text prescribes a specific, measured penalty, a severe public flogging. But the abrogation theory was used to introduce something entirely foreign, stoning to death.
Which is nowhere in the document.
Nowhere. In fact, the text explicitly details how penalties for adultery should be halved for certain vulnerable classes, specifically enslaved women.
And mathematically, you cannot have a death penalty.
Exactly. You can have 100 lashes to 50. You cannot half stone someone to death. Yet through this engineered loophole, a brutal, extra-legal punishment borrowed from older regional traditions was smuggled in.
It completely bypassed the baseline, allowing the ruling class to wield lethal power under the guise of piety. So Naskh wasn't a scholarly debate, it was a hacking tool.
It was a backdoor, installed by the political elite to turn off laws they didn't like and turn on oppressive laws that served them.
But a backdoor is useless if someone notices you using it. It had to be camouflaged. Which brings us to the second massive historical attempts at infiltration, the sheer volume of oral traditions.
The Hadith compilation.
The scale of this is dizzying. We are talking about oral reports of what the reformers supposedly said or did, recorded centuries later.
The lecturer discusses what happened during the Umayyad and Abbasid empires. These were massive, sprawling political entities.
They needed constant justification for their taxation, their wars, how they treated dissidents.
Exactly. So there is this manufactured explosion of oral traditions. The source mentions Imam Bukhari, a highly revered compiler in the 9th century.
And the raw numbers involved turned this into a massive systems engineering problem. How many traditions did Bukhari have to sort through?
The historical record states he collected and evaluated roughly 600,000 oral traditions.
600,000. Let's just sit with that for a second. Contextualize it. It's the 9th century.
No internet, no printing press.
No databases. For 600,000 distinct quotes to be in active circulation, traveling across vast, inhospitable deserts from Persia to North Africa, requiring human chains of transmission, that is not organic folklore.
It requires an industry, a massive, systemic, well-funded generation of data. It was an information war.
Political factions minting fake quotes like modern bot farms minting fake news.
Exactly. And what's most telling is Bukhari's own filtering process. Based on his rigorous criteria, he discarded hundreds of thousands of these reports. He kept only a few thousand.
A few thousand out of 600,000. That's a rejection rate of over 99%.
Right. So the critical systems question is, what does a 99% rejection rate tell us about the environment?
It tells us the environment was absolutely saturated with malware. The status quo realized they couldn't burn the original book because it was too widely distributed, so they decided to drown it.
Drowning the signal is a widely recognized strategy in information theory. Pump enough noise into the channel, the original signal gets lost.
The clarity of the Tamana is buried under a mountain of contradictory Nia.
If you have 600,000 varying accounts of what the law might mean, you effectively have no law at all. It's a chaotic environment where those in power can cherry-pick whichever tradition justifies their current agenda.
But drowning the signal wasn't enough. They had to make the physical words on the page mean different things, which requires hacking the language itself.
The dialect loophole, the myth of the 7 dialects, or a roof.
This is a terrifying example of weaponizing sociolinguistics. The source told a story about Umar and Hisham getting into a physical fight over reciting Surah Al-Furqan.
Right. The Orthodox narrative claims the Quran was revealed in 7 different dialects to accommodate varying tribal accents.
So Umar hears Hisham reciting using words he's never heard, gets furious, drags him to the Prophet, and the Prophet says, both are correct.
It sounds like a nice story about divine accommodation, but the lecturer aggressively dismantles this.
Wow.
Because both Umar and Hisham were from the exact same tribe, the Quraysh of Mecca. They grew up in the same city. They spoke the exact same dialect.
So there was absolutely no linguistic reason for them to be reciting radically different versions.
None. So what was the actual political function of this theory? It served as retroactive justification for sectarian fracturing.
Explain that.
The foundational text explicitly claims to be in a clear, unifying, singular Arabic structure. A core programmatic aim was to unite disparate, warring tribes under one law and one linguistic framework.
Because you cannot build a unified civilization on a fragmented legal code.
Precisely. By claiming the central authority validated the idea that the text could be read and pronounced in 7 vastly different ways, the elite shattered the centralization of the law.
It gave every political faction the ultimate excuse. Our reading of the Constitution is different, but it's equally divine.
It's like drafting a national constitution that says, feel free to translate these laws into whatever localized slang suits your corporate interests and consider it legally binding.
A deliberate recipe for disintegration. The text is no longer a solid benchmark. It's a fluid mirror reflecting political desires.
And it deeply infiltrated academia. Entire disciplines were built cataloging thousands of minor vowel shifts and word substitutions, all protected by this loophole.
So the threat matrix is staggering. You launch a program for equity, the entrenched system responds with abrogation to delete laws, 600,000 fake traditions to drown the signal, and dialect loopholes to fracture the Constitution.
A comprehensive, multi-layered siege.
Which leads to the most crucial pivot here. If the infiltration is this ubiquitous and well-funded, how does the original program survive? How does it avoid becoming just a vehicle for malware?
That transitions us to the law of requital, the system's built-in self-correction.
Let's look at the second half of our text, verse 52. It says, then God abrogates what Satan casts, then God makes firm his signs.
The framing is critical. We are not looking at erratic divine intervention, not a magic trick. It's a corrective loop built into the natural order.
I used an antivirus analogy earlier, but that feels too clean, too painless.
Yeah, it's too passive. The immune response of a civilization is closer to a violent fever. It requires heat, friction, and systemic stress.
So how does it actually work?
The principle is that falsehood, no matter how cleverly injected, cannot survive long-term contact with reason and objective reality. The universe operates on laws of consequence, cause and effect.
So if the elite inject a counterfeit economic policy and nia to hoard wealth,
it eventually produces widespread poverty, market collapse, and unrest. If they inject a counterfeit social law to oppress a group, it produces brain drain and rebellion.
Because the satanic cast is out of alignment with reality, it degrades the society.
Exactly. And the pain of that degradation forces human reason to reevaluate the system, identify the counterfeit, and purge it.
Restoring the genuine automata. But that purging takes time and immense suffering. The source gave historical case studies on this, especially regarding Shia and Sunni divides.
Using them not as theological debates, but illustrating how factions tried to bend the text and how the baseline survived anyway.
Let's look at Muda, temporary marriage. How did that socioeconomic structure get warped?
The Quran lays out a very specific framework for equitable long-term marriage. It requires a mutual contract, a bridal gift or mahr for the woman's financial security, and the intent of a stable household.
A system to protect the vulnerable from being discarded by powerful men.
Right, it forbids secret or transient relationships. But then temporary marriage is introduced.
Which contradicts the whole aim of building stable households. How do they justify it textually?
By attempting to hack the text. They pointed to Surah An-Nisa 4.24 and claimed an early figure, Ibn Abbas, had a different reading of it. They claimed his personal version included an extra phrase to an appointed term.
So they literally claimed that there were missing words in the Constitution to justify a massive loophole.
A loophole that sanctions legalized prostitution for wealthy men who can constantly draft temporary contracts. It's a devastating nia.
Smuggling a privilege back into a system meant to abolish it.
Using the alternate reading loophole.
And the second case study was even more microscopic, the physical act of wudu, washing versus wiping the feet.
This shows how high the stakes are for minor alterations. Surah 5.6 provides instructions for prayer. Wash face, hands, arms, wipe head, and then the contested word regarding feet.
Arjulakum.
Yes. The entire sectarian conflict hinges on a single vowel marker. If read as arjulakum with an A sound.
The accusative ending.
Right. It grammatically connects backward to wash, meaning wash your feet, the standard Sunni position.
And the alternatives.
If read as arjulakum with an S sound, a genitive ending, it connects to the closest preceding action, wipe, meaning wipe your feet. The standard Shia position.
A global schism over an A versus an I is absurd.
It exposes the artificial nature of the conflict. Both factions engaged in violent debates, producing different oral traditions to justify their practice. Some even claimed it was magically revealed both ways.
Which is an insult to a rational system. So amidst all this chaos, missing phrases, vowel shifting, 600K traditions, how did the core program survive?
Because the uncorrupted baseline was physically preserved. Despite claims of missing verses or alternate codices, the central verbatim text, the Uthmanic compilation, remained intact.
The hackers got in the lobby, but the vault holding the master hard drive was never breached.
Exactly. Despite massive hatred, when Sunnis and Shias open their physical copies, it's the exact same text. It was standardized early enough to lock the baseline into physical history.
So the system's guarantee isn't that corruption never enters. It anticipates the breach. The guarantee is that a preserved central baseline exists so reason can continually test corrupted inputs and reject them.
That's the genius of the architecture. You can take the 600K traditions or the abrogation theory, hold them against the unmoving text, and run the checksum.
And say, wait, this contradicts the Talmud. This is an ania. Purge it.
Which brings us to the synthesis. Truth isn't about existing in a sterile vacuum.
It's proven by its capacity to keep purging distortion and reestablishing itself.
Cyclical regeneration. The lecturer himself was criticized for applying this logic. He was labeled Munkir-e-Hadith, a rejecter of traditions.
Because he refused the malware.
He was ostracized for demanding the historical baggage be measured against the unoperable text. He was treated as a threat for activating the immune response.
Like a white hat hacker getting banned by corrupt admin. So what's the practical takeaway for the listener? Building a startup, drafting policy, evaluating beliefs.
Expect the hijack. When you launch a true initiative that demands real equity, the system will try to co-opt it.
You'll see the linea injected into your Tamanat. Don't be paralyzed.
Trust the correcting mechanism. If you have a solid baseline, use rigorous reason tested against real-world results to strip the counterfeit.
You don't abandon the project because of bad code. You reject the pull request and keep building.
It's a continuous process of civilizational maintenance.
The distortion is a feature of the human environment, not a bug in the truth. So to wrap up, look at your own life. The foundational beliefs, workplaces, institutions you trust.
What is the corrective mechanism there?
Exactly. When the status quo injects a compromise, do you have a benchmark absolute enough to identify the counterfeit? Do you have the tools to run the checksum and purge the, Or are you just accepting the malware as part of the operating system? Thank you for joining us on this intense structural analysis. Keep questioning the code.